Greetings, traveller. The morning mist clung to the jungle canopy like a lover reluctant to let go, filtering the golden sunlight into dancing patterns across the forest floor. Nimblewick Shadowgear moved through this dappled world with the fluid grace of water finding its path downhill, each footfall silent against the carpet of decomposing leaves and vibrant moss. His small frame, typical of his gnomish heritage, seemed almost to fade between the massive buttressed roots of ancient trees that towered impossibly high above him. He paused beside a flowering vine that cascaded down from the canopy in a waterfall of purple blooms, its sweet fragrance mixing with the rich, earthy scent of the jungle. A jewel-bright bird with iridescent feathers watched him from a nearby branch, tilting its head with curious intelligence before deciding he posed no threat and returning to its morning preening. Nimblewick smiled at this small interaction. In the jungle, trust was earned through patience and respect, qualities that served him well in his chosen profession. The gnome's weathered leather armor bore the patina of countless adventures, its deep brown surface marked with the subtle scars of brambles, blade edges, and narrow escapes. His tools hung at his belt with practiced precision, lockpicks wrapped in silk, throwing knives balanced to perfection, a coil of spider silk rope that could bear 3 times his weight, and various other implements whose purposes would be clear only to those who shared his particular talents. Everything about Nimblewick spoke of competence earned through necessity, of survival refined into an art form. As he moved deeper into the jungle, following game trails that wound between towering ferns and stands of bamboo, then creaked gently in the humid breeze, Nimblewick's mind wandered to the question that had haunted him for the better part of his 43 years. Gnomes, by the reckoning of most scholars, lived perhaps 80 years if they were fortunate and careful. He was already past the halfway point of his allotted span, and what did he have to show for it? No clan to call his own, no hearth to return to, no legacy save the whispered stories of jobs completed and treasures claimed. The thought didn't bring him sadness exactly, but rather a restless dissatisfaction that had grown stronger with each passing season. He had mastered the arts of stealth and infiltration, could pick locks that stymied master craftsmen, and move through shadows as if he were made of moonlight and wishes. Yet what good were these skills if they only delayed the inevitable march toward old age and the grave? He settled into the hollow of a massive tree root to rest, pulling a piece of dried fruit from his pack and chewing it thoughtfully. The jungle hummed around him with the constant symphony of life. The distant call of howler monkeys echoing through the canopy, the rustle of something large moving through the underbrush, the gentle patter of condensation dripping from leaf to leaf. This island had been his home for nearly 6 months now, ever since he had fled the complications of his last job in the mainland city of Corinth. It was a good place to disappear, to let old enemies forget and new opportunities present themselves. The sound of voices carried through the still air, causing Nimblewick to freeze with the fruit halfway to his mouth. Years of staying alive in dangerous places had honed his instincts to a razor's edge, and something about these voices set every nerve on alert. They were speaking in the guttural, harsh tones of goblin speech, but with the particular dialect and swagger that marked them as sea folk. pirates then, and given their relaxed manner, they felt confident in their safety. Nimblewick slipped from his resting place like a shadow-given substance, moving toward the voices with the patience of a hunting cat. He had learned long ago that information was often more valuable than gold, and pirates were notorious for carrying both. The jungle itself seemed to conspire with his approach, providing fallen logs to creep along and dense curtains of hanging vines to conceal his movements. Through a screen of broad-leafed plants, he could see them, 3 goblin pirates taking their ease beside a small stream that bubbled and gurgled over smooth stones. Their clothing marked them as crew from one of the more successful vessels. Silk-trimmed coats over leather armor, weapons that gleamed with good maintenance, and boots that had seen many ports but were far from worn out. They had beached a small boat nearby and were apparently resting during some sort of reconnaissance mission. The largest of the 3, a scarred goblin with gold teeth that glinted when he spoke, was regaling his companions with what sounded like a familiar boast. Nimblewick settled himself more comfortably and prepared to listen, knowing that pirates' boasts often contained useful intelligence wrapped in bluster and exaggeration. "I tell you, lads," Goldteeth was saying, taking a long pull from a leather flask before passing it to his companions. "Never seen Captain Bloodtide so pleased with a haul. 3 merchant vessels in 1 week, and that last one carrying cargo that made even the quartermaster's eyes go wide." "Aye," agreed the second pirate, a wiry goblin with intricate tattoos covering his arms. "But it's what we took from that Elvish trader that has the whole crew talking. Never seen the captain handle anything so carefully." The third pirate, younger than the others, and with the eager manner of someone still trying to prove himself, leaned forward conspiratorially. "My cousin works in the vault complex back at Goldgrin Harbor. Says they've got the chest locked away deeper than anything else they've ever stored. 3 separate chambers, each with its own guards and traps." Nimblewick's interest sharpened. Goldgrin Harbor was legendary among those who sailed the southern seas, a pirate haven built on a natural harbor where the corrupt and the clever could trade freely without interference from any legitimate government. If something was secured there with unusual care, it was worth investigating. "What's so special about one chest?" the tattooed goblin wondered aloud, scratching at his head with a clawed finger. "We've taken plenty of Elvish goods before." Goldteeth grinned, his metallic teeth catching the filtered sunlight. "This wasn't trade goods, mate. This was from their archives. Ancient scrolls, books older than some kingdoms, that sort of thing. The kind of items that collectors pay ridiculous sums for." "But why the extra security?" pressed the younger pirate. "Usually we just toss that sort of thing in the general storage and let the fence masters sort it out." "Because," Goldteeth said, lowering his voice dramatically, "one of those scrolls is supposed to be special, really special. The kind of special that makes grown pirates whisper and cross themselves when they think nobody's looking." The tattooed goblin rolled his eyes. "Don't tell me you believe those old stories about magical scrolls and mystic powers." "Believe what you want," Goldteeth shrugged, "but I saw the captain's face when that Elvish merchant was begging for his life offering to tell us which scroll was which in exchange for a quick death, called one of them the Scroll of Endless Days, and claimed it could grant immortality to whoever performed its ritual correctly. The words hit Nimblewick like a physical blow. Immortality, the one prize that could solve his greatest problem, the one treasure that would make all his skills truly meaningful. If such a thing existed, if there was even a chance it might be real, then every risk would be justified. Course, could all be nonsense? Gold Teeth continued, taking another drink. But the captain thought it worth securing properly, and I've seen enough strange things in my years at sea to keep an open mind about such matters. Even if it were real, the young pirate said thoughtfully, what would anyone do with immortality? Live forever, watching the world change around them? Better than dying old and forgotten, the tattooed goblin muttered. Though I suppose it would get lonely after a few centuries. They continued talking, but their conversation drifted to more mundane topics. Complaints about shipboard food, speculation about their next targets, and good-natured insults about each other's seamanship. Nimblewick remained perfectly still, his mind racing with possibilities and plans. When the pirates finally gathered their gear and pushed their boat back into the stream, heading toward what he assumed was a hidden harbor somewhere along the island's coast, he watched them go with the intensity of a hawk studying potential prey. As the sound of their voices faded into the jungle's ambient chorus, Nimblewick allowed himself to truly consider what he had overheard. Goldgrin Harbor was not a place where honest folk went to conduct business. It was a den of thieves, pirates, and worse, built around a natural harbor that provided perfect concealment for vessels engaged in less than legal activities. The city itself was said to be a maze of taverns, brothels, fighting pits, and markets where anything could be bought or sold for the right price. More importantly for his purposes, it was also home to one of the most secure storage facilities in the known world. Pirates needed somewhere to keep their accumulated wealth safe from rivals, and Goldgrin Harbor's vault complex had been built to satisfy that need. Multiple levels, each more secure than the last, protected by a combination of mechanical traps, magical wards, and guards selected for their loyalty and discretion. Breaking into such a place would be the challenge of a lifetime, the sort of job that master thieves dreamed about and wise thieves avoided. The risks would be enormous. Capture would mean death, or worse, and even success would paint a target on his back that would never fade. Every pirate lord, ambitious captain, and treasure hunter would know his name and want to test their skills against the gnome who had breached the supposedly impregnable vaults of Goldgrin Harbor. But if the reward was truly immortality, then no risk was too great. Nimblewick made his way back through the jungle with a new sense of purpose, his mind already beginning to work through the countless details that would need to be addressed. First, he would need to find passage to Goldgrin Harbor. Not easy for someone with his reputation, but not impossible. Then would come the weeks of careful reconnaissance, studying the city's layout, identifying weak points in its defenses, and gathering the specialized equipment such a job would require. He reached his current camp as the sun was beginning its descent toward the western horizon, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose that filtered through the canopy in a gentle, shifting light. His shelter was modest, but well concealed. A tarp stretched between several trees, with careful attention paid to drainage and sight lines. Everything he owned could be packed and moved within minutes if necessary, a habit that had served him well over the years. As he prepared his evening meal over a small, nearly smokeless fire, Nimblewick allowed himself to imagine what success might look like. Immortality would mean time, endless time to perfect his craft, to see wonders that had not yet been discovered, to accumulate knowledge and experience beyond anything currently possible. He could become the greatest thief in history, not through fame or recognition, but through the simple accumulation of centuries of practice. The thought was both thrilling and sobering. The young pirate's question echoed in his mind. What would anyone do with immortality? It was a fair question, and one he would have to answer for himself if his plan succeeded. But first, he would have to survive long enough to make the attempt. As night settled over the jungle and the familiar sounds of nocturnal creatures began their evening chorus, Nimblewick sat beside his dying fire and began to plan. Tomorrow he would begin the long journey toward Goldgrin Harbor and whatever destiny awaited him there. Tonight, he would allow himself to dream of impossible things and endless possibilities, while the jungle kept its patient watch around him. The first step would be finding a ship willing to take on a passenger with flexible morals and a talent for avoiding difficult questions. Fortunately, he knew exactly where to look for such accommodations. The saltwater serpent cut through the choppy waters with the easy confidence of a vessel that had seen countless storms and emerged victorious from each one. Nimblewick stood at the rail, watching the horizon where a smudge of dark smoke marked their destination, still half a day's sailing away. The sea air carried the mingled scents of brine, tar, and the peculiar mixture of exotic spices and rotting fish that seemed to cling to all pirate vessels. Captain Razorclaw, a grizzled goblin whose missing left eye had been replaced with a gem that glittered within a fire, had asked surprisingly few questions when Nimblewick approached him at the tavern in Port Blackwater. Gold spoke louder than curiosity in such places, and the gnome's coin had been genuine enough to secure passage without excessive scrutiny. The crew treated him with the casual indifference reserved for paying passengers who minded their own business, exactly the sort of anonymity he preferred. "First time to Goldgrin Harbor?" asked Skizix, the ship's navigator, joining him at the rail. The elderly goblin's hands were stained with ink from his charts, and his sharp eyes held the particular intelligence that came from years of reading wind and wave. "First time," Nimblewick confirmed, not entirely truthfully. He had been within sight of the harbour once before, years ago, but had never actually set foot in the city itself. "Sight to behold," Skizix said with evident pride. "Grew up there, I did, before the sea called to me. Most folk think it's just another pirate den, but there's more civilization in Goldgrin Harbor than in half the so-called legitimate ports I've visited." As they drew closer, Nimblewick could see what the navigator meant. The harbour was indeed a natural wonder, a deep, circular bay almost completely enclosed by towering cliffs that provided both protection from storms and concealment from unwanted visitors. But it was what had been built within those cliffs that truly impressed. The city rose in terraces carved directly into the rock face, connected by switchbacking paths, rope bridges, and mechanical lifts powered by complex systems of counterweights and pulleys. Buildings seemed to grow from the stone itself, their facades decorated with elaborate carvings and painted in vibrant colors that caught and held the tropical sunlight. Waterfalls cascaded down from hidden springs high above, their mist creating rainbow effects in the afternoon light. The lower levels are where most of the commerce happens, Skizix explained, following Nimblewick's gaze. Taverns, markets, the fighting pits, that sort of thing. Middle levels are for the more successful captains and their crews, better lodging, fancier establishments. Upper levels. He paused, a note of reverence entering his voice. Those are for the harbour lords and their chosen few. They say some of the chambers up there have never seen natural sunlight, lit only by captured starlight and other wonders. And the vault complex? Nimblewick asked, keeping his voice carefully casual. Ah, that's something else entirely. Skizix grinned, showing teeth filed to points in the goblin fashion. Built right into the heart of the mountain itself, it is, independent of the rest of the city, with its own entrances and exits. They say the builders were dwarven master craftsmen, paid so well for their work that they retired to their own private islands afterward. The saltwater serpent navigated through increasingly busy waters as they approached the harbour proper. Ships of every description crowded the anchorage, sleek sloops built for speed, massive galleons heavy with cannon, exotic vessels from distant lands with sails of silk and hulls decorated with precious metals. The variety was staggering, representing every maritime culture Nimblewick had ever heard of, and several he had not. Captain Razorclaw handled the docking negotiations personally, speaking rapid goblin cant with the harbour master's representatives. Gold changed hands, documents were stamped with elaborate seals, and, within an hour of dropping anchor, Nimblewick found himself standing on solid ground for the first time in nearly 2 weeks. The lower harbour district assaulted his senses with its intensity. Merchants hawked everything from rare spices to exotic weapons, their voices competing with street musicians, arguing sailors, and the constant background noise of commerce being conducted in a dozen different languages. The air was thick with smoke from cooking fires, tobacco pipes, and the occasional alchemical experiment gone slightly wrong. Nimblewick had prepared 3 different identities for his stay in Goldgrin Harbor, complete with supporting documentation and carefully constructed histories. For now, he was Pip Coin Whisper, a freelance appraiser of antiquities with a reputation for discretion and a willingness to work with clients who preferred to avoid official scrutiny. It was a role that would let him move through the city's merchant community while asking the sorts of questions that might otherwise seem suspicious. He found lodging at the Gilded Anchor, a mid-level establishment that catered to successful but not ostentatious visitors. The room was small but clean, with a window that offered a carefully limited view of the harbour below. More importantly, it provided several potential escape routes and was positioned to let him observe the comings and goings of other guests without being obvious about it. Over the next several days, Nimblewick immersed himself in the rhythm of the city, learning its customs, identifying its power structures, and beginning the delicate process of gathering intelligence about his target. The vault complex, he discovered, was even more impressive than the pirates' boasts had suggested. Built into the living rock of the mountain, it consisted of 7 distinct levels, each progressively more secure than the last. The first 3 levels were accessible to anyone willing to pay the storage fees and submit to the facility's security procedures. These held the bulk of the pirates' accumulated wealth: chests of coins, bags of precious stones, artwork looted from 1,000 different sources. The 4th and 5th levels required special authorization and were reserved for items of particular value or sensitivity. Access was limited to account holders and their designated representatives, with security measures that included both magical wards and mechanical traps designed by the finest craftsmen gold could buy. The 6th level was legendary even among the pirates themselves, said to hold treasures so valuable that their very existence was kept secret from all but the highest-ranking harbor lords. Few had ever seen it, and fewer still would admit to such knowledge publicly. The 7th level was whispered about in the same tones reserved for ghost stories and sailors' superstitions. Some claimed it didn't exist at all, that it was merely a rumor designed to enhance the facility's fearsome reputation. Others insisted it was real but empty, a final vault prepared for some treasure so magnificent that it had not yet been found. If the information Nimblewick had gathered was accurate, the scroll he sought was being held on the 5th level in the high security section reserved for items of unusual magical significance. Getting there would require bypassing 4 levels of increasingly sophisticated defenses, not to mention actually locating the correct storage container among hundreds of similar chests and boxes. The challenge was daunting enough to discourage any reasonable person, which Nimblewick supposed was rather the point. Fortunately, he had long ago abandoned any pretense of being entirely reasonable. His first breakthrough came through careful observation of the facility's staff. Like any large operation, the vault complex employed dozens of workers in various capacities: guards, maintenance personnel, clerks, and specialists in magical security. Most lived in the city itself, following predictable routines that could be studied and potentially exploited. Of particular interest was Grizak, a goblin locksmith whose job involved maintaining and upgrading the complex mechanical security systems. The fellow was a creature of rigid habits, taking the same route to work each morning, eating lunch at the same tavern, and spending his evenings at a particular gambling house where he indulged a passion for dice games with more enthusiasm than skill. Nimblewick began frequenting the same establishments, gradually inserting himself into Grizak's social circle through a combination of lucky gambling, well-timed drinks, and carefully crafted stories about his adventures as an antiquities appraiser. The locksmith proved to be a lonely sort, eager for companionship and surprisingly willing to discuss his work with someone who showed genuine interest in the technical aspects of his craft. The beauty of the system. Grizak explained one evening over mugs of the potent local rum, is that it's not just locks and keys. Each level responds to different types of opening mechanisms, some mechanical, some magical, some requiring specific items or knowledge to bypass. Even if someone managed to get past the first few barriers, they'd be completely stumped by the deeper levels. Fascinating, Nimblewick replied, playing the role of the interested amateur. I've seen some impressive security measures in private collections, but nothing on that scale. The magical components must be particularly complex. Oh, they are, Grizak nodded enthusiastically. Ward stones keyed to specific individuals, proximity spells that react to unauthorized presence, even a few nasty surprises for anyone who tries to force their way through. I don't work on those myself. That's specialist magic way beyond my skills. But I maintain the physical mechanisms that support them. Over several such conversations, Nimblewick pieced together a rough understanding of the vault's layout and security protocols. The entrance was through a nondescript building in the merchant district, with the actual vaults extending deep into the mountain behind it. Each level was separated by a complex series of doors, corridors, and chambers designed to compartmentalize access and prevent unauthorized movement between sections. The guards worked in rotating shifts, with different personnel responsible for each level. They were well-paid professionals with strong loyalties to their employers, making bribery or corruption unlikely. However, they were also accustomed to a certain level of routine, which might provide opportunities for someone patient enough to study their patterns. The magical defenses were more problematic. While Nimblewick had some experience with bypassing minor ward spells and protective enchantments, the vault complex employed magic on a scale that would challenge even master practitioners. He would need to find ways around such obstacles rather than attempting to overcome them directly. His second breakthrough came through pure chance, as many of the best discoveries did. While exploring the city's extensive market district, he encountered a small shop that specialized in what its proprietor euphemistically called professional tools. The owner, an ancient goblin named Wickai, who claimed to have been one of the original settlers of Goldgrin Harbor, maintained a stock of items that would be highly illegal in most civilized jurisdictions. Looking for anything in particular? Wickai asked, studying Nimblewick with eyes that missed nothing despite their roomy appearance. Just browsing, Nimblewick replied, examining a set of lockpicks whose craftsmanship was genuinely impressive. I occasionally need specialized equipment for my appraisal work. Ah, an appraiser, Wickai nodded knowingly. Sometimes need to get into things to properly evaluate them, I expect. Perfectly understandable line of work. Among the shop's inventory, Nimblewick discovered several items that would be invaluable for his planned infiltration. A set of magical tools designed to detect and temporarily disable ward spells. A cloak that would help him blend with shadows. And, most importantly, a small device that could create perfect impressions of complex keys with just a few seconds of contact. Expensive items, Wickai noted as Nimblewick examined the key-copying device. But then, quality work always commands premium prices. I assume a professional such as yourself understands the value of reliable equipment. The negotiations were complex and conducted in the sort of coded language that allowed both parties to maintain plausible deniability about the transaction's true nature. By the time they concluded their business, Nimblewick had spent nearly half of his available funds, but had acquired tools that would significantly improve his chances of success. With his equipment secured and his intelligence gathering nearly complete, Nimblewick began the final phase of his preparation, detailed reconnaissance of the vault facility itself. This required the greatest caution, as too much obvious interest would certainly attract unwanted attention. He approached the problem obliquely, using his cover identity as an antiquities appraiser to request tours of the public storage areas. Such visits were not uncommon. Wealthy collectors often wanted to inspect the security arrangements before committing valuable items to storage. The facility's management was happy to accommodate such requests, seeing them as opportunities to demonstrate their capabilities and attract new clients. The tours provided invaluable information about the building's layout, the positioning of guards, and the general flow of daily operations. Nimblewick memorized every detail: the location of stairwells and service corridors, the timing of guard rotations, the placement of magical detection devices, and the subtle indicators that mark transitions between different security zones. Of particular importance was his observation of the facility's delivery and maintenance protocols. Large items entered through a separate loading dock that connected directly to service elevators capable of reaching all 7 levels. Maintenance personnel used their own access routes, with special passes that allowed them to move between different security zones as their duties required. It was during one of these reconnaissance visits that Nimblewick had his first direct glimpse of his ultimate target. While being shown through a section of the 4th level, he caught sight of a heavily guarded corridor that led deeper into the complex. According to his guide, that area contained some of their most valuable holdings, items that required special storage conditions and enhanced security measures. "We don't usually allow visitors into that section," the guide explained apologetically, "but I can tell you that our 5th level facilities represent the absolute pinnacle of secure storage technology. Items stored there are protected by measures that would challenge even the most determined thieves." Nimblewick nodded politely and made appropriate impressed noises, all while his mind raced with plans and possibilities. He was close now, closer than he had ever been to a prize that could change everything about his existence. The scroll was there, somewhere beyond those guarded corridors, waiting for someone bold enough and skilled enough to claim it. As he concluded his tour and returned to the bright chaos of Goldgrin Harbor streets, Nimblewick felt the familiar mixture of anticipation and fear that preceded every major job. The preparation phase was nearly complete. Soon, it would be time to put his plans into motion and discover whether the legendary security of the vault complex was truly as impregnable as its reputation suggested. The thought brought a crooked smile to his weathered features. After all, legends were made to be tested, and he had built his entire career on proving that nothing was truly impossible for someone with sufficient skill, patience, and audacity. Tonight, he would finalize his preparations. Tomorrow, he would begin the most dangerous endeavor of his life. The darkness before dawn held a quality of stillness that Nimblewick had learned to appreciate over his many years of nocturnal activities. It was the hour when even the most dedicated revelers had finally succumbed to exhaustion, when the city's guards were at their most complacent, and when shadows seemed to deepen and welcome those who knew how to move within them. He made his final preparations in the silence of his room at the Gilded Anchor, checking each piece of equipment with the methodical care that had kept him alive through countless dangerous situations. The magical tools from Wickey's shop were secured in specially padded pouches, the key copying device nestled against his ribs where it would be easily accessible, but well protected. His lockpicks, cleaned and oiled to perfection, rested in their silk wrapping like surgeons' instruments awaiting a delicate operation. The approach to the vault facility required him to become 3 different people in succession, each identity serving a specific purpose in his carefully orchestrated plan. First, he was Merc, a drunken sailor staggering home from a night of debauchery, providing cover for his movement through the city's twisting streets. Then he became Skitter, a maintenance worker arriving early for his shift, complete with forged credentials and a stolen uniform that fit well enough to pass casual inspection. Finally, when the moment came, he would transform into his truest self, the shadow that moved between identities, belonging fully to none but capable of assuming any. The loading dock was exactly as he had observed during his reconnaissance, with the same goblin guard manning the checkpoint and the same mechanical lift that provided access to the facility's upper levels. The forged work order he presented bore all the correct seals and signatures, requesting routine maintenance on the 5th level's humidity control systems. A task mundane enough to avoid scrutiny, but important enough to justify access to the high security areas. "Early start today," the guard commented, stamping Nimblewick's papers with bureaucratic efficiency. "Aye," Nimblewick replied in the rough accent he had practiced. "Want to get this done before the real heat of the day sets in. Those upper levels get stifling when the sun's full up." The elevator ride seemed to last an eternity, though his pocket chronometer assured him it was less than 3 minutes. Each level they passed represented another barrier overcome, another step closer to his goal. When the mechanism finally shuddered to a halt and the doors opened onto the 5th level, Nimblewick felt his heart hammering against his ribs with an intensity that had nothing to do with physical exertion. The corridors here were different from the public areas he had toured earlier. The walls were covered in seamless stone that seemed to absorb sound, creating an almost oppressive quiet, broken only by the distant hum of ventilation systems and the occasional soft chime of magical monitoring devices. Illumination came from crystals embedded in the ceiling at regular intervals, their cold light creating pools of visibility separated by stretches of deeper shadow. Moving through this environment required all of his accumulated skills, every lesson learned through years of similar infiltrations. He had studied the guard rotations during his reconnaissance visits, timing their movements to the minute. The magical detection devices were more challenging, but the tools from Wickey's shop proved their worth, creating brief windows of blindness that allowed him to slip past their watchful sensors. The storage chambers themselves were arranged along branching corridors that extended deep into the mountain's heart. Each door bore a complex numbering system that corresponded to detailed records maintained by the facility's administrators. Finding the specific chamber that held the chest from the Elvish trader required careful navigation through this labyrinth, cross-referencing the information he had gathered against the reality of the vault's layout. He found it in a chamber marked with symbols that indicated both magical containment and special environmental controls. The door itself was a masterwork of defensive engineering. 3 separate locking mechanisms, each more complex than the last, protected by ward spells that would alert the guards to any unauthorized intrusion attempt. This was the moment that would determine whether months of preparation had been sufficient, whether his skills were truly equal to the challenge he had set himself. Nimblewick settled into the peculiar mental state that served him during such work. A combination of intense focus and almost meditative calm that allowed him to perform at the very peak of his abilities. The first lock yielded to conventional techniques, its mechanical complexity no match for picks guided by decades of experience. The second required the magical tools from Wickey's shop, their ethereal energies temporarily disrupting the ward spells long enough for him to manipulate the underlying mechanism. The third and final barrier was the most elegant, a puzzle lock that demanded not just technical skill, but genuine understanding of its creator's intentions. When the door finally opened with a soft whisper of displaced air, Nimblewick felt a moment of pure triumph that was immediately tempered by the knowledge that his greatest challenges still lay ahead. The chamber beyond contained dozens of storage containers, each carefully labeled and positioned according to some system that made sense only to the facility's administrators. The chest he sought stood apart from the others, its elvish craftsmanship immediately recognizable even in the crystal light's cold illumination. The wood was a deep, rich brown that seemed to hold depths like still water, inlaid with silver tracery that formed patterns both beautiful and meaningful to those trained in such lore. Even closed and secured, it radiated a sense of significance that made the surrounding containers seem mundane by comparison. The chest's lock was a work of art in itself, its mechanism so cunningly designed that picking it became less a matter of technique than of philosophical understanding. Elvish locksmiths, Nimblewick knew, created their masterworks to reflect the natural world's patterns. The spiral of a nautilus shell, the branching of tree roots, the crystalline structure of winter ice. To open such a lock required thinking like the forest itself, patient and organic and utterly without haste. Time seemed to slow as he worked, his world contracting to the immediate reality of metal and magic beneath his fingers. The picks became extensions of his will, finding their way through the mechanism's complexities with a sureness that came from perfect unity of purpose and technique. When the lock finally yielded, opening with a sound like a summer breeze through leaves, Nimblewick felt as though he had just conducted a symphony composed of silence and shadow. Inside the chest, nested in silk padding that still held the faint fragrance of distant elvish forests, lay exactly what the pirates had described. Ancient scrolls, their parchment yellow with age but still supple to the touch, covered in script that seemed to shift and dance in the crystal light. Most bore the sort of scholarly annotations and marginalia that marked them as academic works, valuable to collectors but of little practical significance. But one scroll was different. It lay apart from the others, wrapped in cloth that had once been white but had aged to the colour of old ivory. The moment his fingers touched it, Nimblewick felt a sensation like static electricity, a tingling that seemed to reach beyond his physical form to touch something deeper. The parchment itself was unlike anything he had ever encountered, neither plant nor animal in origin, but something that existed in the spaces between such categories. The script covering its surface was ancient beyond reckoning, written in a language that predated the rise and fall of empires. Yet, as he studied the words, their meaning became clear to him through means he could not explain. The scroll of endless days, just as the dying Elvish merchant had claimed. The ritual described within its lines was complex but not impossible, requiring components that were rare but obtainable, and, most importantly, it carried the unmistakable resonance of genuine magical authority. This was real. After all his planning, all his risks, all his careful infiltration of one of the world's most secure facilities, he had found exactly what he had dared to hope for, a pathway to immortality itself. The moment of discovery was shattered by a sound that sent ice through his veins, the soft chime that indicated a security breach somewhere in the facility. For a heartbeat, Nimblewick wondered if he had somehow triggered an alarm he had not detected. Then the sound came again, followed by the distant but growing noise of voices and running feet. Someone else was in the vault complex, someone whose presence had been detected by systems that had failed to notice his own careful infiltration. Whether they were competitors seeking the same prize, desperate thieves attracted by the facility's legendary wealth, or simply unfortunate enough to have chosen the worst possible night for their attempt, their presence had doomed his own mission to discovery. The failsafe that the pirates had mentioned was not magical in nature, as he had assumed, but rather a simple mechanical device triggered by multiple simultaneous security breaches. As alarms began to sound throughout the complex and emergency lighting bathed the corridors in harsh red illumination, Nimblewick realized that his carefully planned infiltration had just become a desperate escape attempt. But he had the scroll. Whatever happened next, whatever prices he might have to pay for this night's work, he had achieved his primary objective. The pathway to immortality was literally in his hands, and no force in the world would make him abandon it now. The smoke that began filling the corridor was not part of any alarm system he had studied. Dense and acrid, it carried the particular chemical signature of alchemical compounds, designed for concealment rather than harm. Someone had come prepared for exactly this sort of emergency, and their preparations were now serving his purposes as well as their own. Nimblewick wrapped the scroll carefully and secured it inside his jacket, then began moving through the chaos with the fluid grace that had served him through countless similar situations. The smoke provided perfect concealment for someone who knew how to use it, transforming the corridor into a maze of shifting shadows and muffled sounds. The other intruders, whoever they were, had triggered every alarm in the facility and brought guards running from all directions. In the confusion, one more figure moving through the smoke-filled passages was unlikely to attract specific attention, especially if that figure knew exactly where he was going and how to get there quickly. The service elevator was no longer an option, its shaft now filled with armed guards responding to the emergency. But Nimblewick's reconnaissance had revealed alternative routes, maintenance shafts, emergency stairways, and service corridors that connected the different levels. Moving through them required agility and precise knowledge of the facility's layout, but offered pathways that bypassed the main security checkpoints. The climb down through the building's hidden passages was harrowing, each level presenting new obstacles and dangers. Guards were everywhere, their voices echoing through the corridors as they attempted to coordinate their response to an unprecedented security breach. Emergency protocols that had never been tested in actual practice were being implemented with varying degrees of success, creating confusion that worked to Nimblewick's advantage. He reached the ground level just as the first external reinforcements arrived. Harbor Guard units summoned by the facility's administrators, their torches and lanterns turning the surrounding streets into a maze of moving light and shadow. The loading dock was impossible now, sealed off and heavily guarded. But the city of Goldgrin Harbor had been built by pirates for pirates, and those who knew its secrets could find ways through obstacles that would stop law-abiding citizens. The sewer system that carried waste and storm runoff down to the harbor was ancient, predating the current city by several centuries. Its tunnels connected to chambers and passages that had been carved by the island's original inhabitants, creating a hidden network that ran parallel to the more visible city above. Accessing it required knowledge that was carefully guarded by those who made their living in the shadows. But Nimblewick had made it his business to acquire such information during his weeks of preparation. The descent into the sewers was like entering another world, one where the rules of civilized society held no sway and survival depended entirely on cunning and preparation. The tunnels were dark, treacherous, and filled with dangers both natural and artificial. But they offered something that no surface route could provide, a path to the harbor that bypassed every checkpoint and guard post in the city. The journey through the underground took nearly 2 hours, each minute marked by the growing sounds of chaos from the streets above. By the time Nimblewick emerged from a concealed outlet near the harbor's edge, the entire city was in uproar. Ships' bells were ringing throughout the anchorage, signal fires blazed from the watchtowers, and patrol boats moved between the anchored vessels with military precision. The small boat he had prepared for exactly this contingency waited where he had hidden it, tied to an abandoned pier in a section of the harbor that legitimate vessels avoided. It was nothing fancy, just a sturdy fishing craft with a reliable engine and supplies for several days at sea. But it represented freedom, the difference between capture and escape, between failure and the chance to complete his ultimate goal. As he prepared to cast off, Nimblewick caught sight of movement in the water nearby. Another small boat, its occupant moving with the same desperate urgency that drove his own actions. In the reflected light from the harbor's emergency illumination, he glimpsed a figure he recognized. One of the other intruders whose presence had triggered the security response, a goblin thief whose reputation was nearly as impressive as his own. Their eyes met across the water for a brief moment, and in that instant, Nimblewick saw his own determination reflected in the other's expression. They had both risked everything for their respective prizes, and both had succeeded despite the chaos that had consumed their escape. There was a certain professional respect in that recognition, an acknowledgement between practitioners of the same dangerous art. Then both boats were moving, heading out of the harbour on different courses, carrying their operators toward whatever destinations awaited them. Behind them, Goldgrin Harbor blazed with light and activity as its defenders attempted to assess the full scope of the night's unprecedented security breach. Nimblewick did not look back. His attention was focused entirely on the future now, on the open sea that stretched endlessly before him, and the scroll that rested securely in his jacket. The most dangerous part of his mission was complete, but the most important part still lay ahead. 3 days later, on a small uninhabited island that appeared on no official charts, Nimblewick prepared to change the fundamental nature of his existence. The ritual described in the Scroll of Endless Days was complex, but not beyond his capabilities, requiring components he had been able to gather during his careful preparation and an understanding of magical principles that any competent practitioner could master. The island itself seemed appropriate for such a momentous undertaking, a small volcanic peak rising from the deep ocean, its slopes covered in strange plants that grew nowhere else in the world. Fresh water flowed from springs that had never known contamination, and the air itself seemed charged with possibilities. He had memorized every word of the scroll during his voyage, understanding that the ritual must be performed with perfect precision if it was to succeed. The slightest error, the smallest deviation from the prescribed procedures, could result in failure or worse. But the instructions were clear, and his determination was absolute. The ritual began at sunset, when the boundary between day and night created the liminal conditions necessary for such profound transformation. Nimblewick spoke words in the ancient language, their syllables seeming to resonate with powers that existed beyond the normal world of cause and effect. The components he had gathered, rare minerals, exotic plants, substances that existed at the intersection of the physical and magical realms, combined according to precise formulas that had been old when the first civilizations were young. The magic, when it came, was nothing like the gentle enchantments he had encountered in his previous experience. It struck him like lightning made of pure will, tearing through his body and spirit with an intensity that would have destroyed anything less completely committed to the transformation. Every nerve blazed with agony that transcended physical sensation, every thought scattered like leaves before a hurricane of change. But he endured, holding to his purpose with the same determination that had carried him through the vault complex and out of Goldgrin Harbor. The pain was temporary, he reminded himself, through the chaos of transformation. The result would last forever. When the magic finally released its hold on him, Nimblewick collapsed onto the island's rocky shore, his body unchanged in appearance but fundamentally altered in ways that would only become apparent with time. He could feel the difference immediately, a sense of connection to forces that operated on scales far grander than individual mortal existence. An awareness that his personal timeline now extended beyond any horizon he could imagine. The scroll, its purpose finally fulfilled, crumbled to dust in his hands as the last traces of the ancient magic departed from it. The wind carried the fragments out over the ocean, returning them to the same vast cycles that had created them uncounted ages ago. Nimblewick stood slowly, testing his transformed body and finding it exactly as it had been before, yet somehow fundamentally different. He would need time to fully understand what he had become, to explore the implications of his new existence and decide how to use the endless years that now stretched before him. The crooked smile that crossed his weathered features held equal measures of triumph and uncertainty. He had achieved the impossible, defied mortality itself through skill, determination, and a willingness to risk everything for the ultimate prize. But as he stood alone on the small island, watching the sun disappear into the endless ocean, he began to understand the true scope of what he had won. Immortality meant watching the world change around him while he remained constant. It meant seeing friends age and die while he continued unchanged, accumulating memories and experiences that would eventually dwarf any single mortal lifetime. It meant becoming something more and less than human, a living legend that would inspire stories and songs for centuries yet unborn. The thought was both exhilarating and sobering, but Nimblewick found himself embracing it with the same courage that had carried him through every challenge of his mortal life. He had built his entire existence on the principle that nothing was impossible for someone with sufficient skill and determination. Now he would have infinite time to test that principle, to see what wonders and accomplishments might be possible for a master thief who never had to worry about the limitations of a mortal lifespan. As the stars emerged in the darkening sky above, Nimblewick began planning his next moves. There were kingdoms to explore, treasures to discover, and adventures to undertake that no mortal could even imagine. The small boat that had carried him to this island would take him back to the world of mortals, but he would never again be entirely part of that world. He had become something new, a figure who would walk through history like a shadow, appearing in stories and legends, accomplishing impossible feats, and disappearing again before anyone could fully understand what they had witnessed. The thought brought his crooked smile back, wider and more confident than before. After all, he had work to do, and now he had all the time in the world to do it properly.